Hi and welcome, Adrian. How is it?
Yeah, great today. Thanks, Nana, for inviting me along to your webinar.
Yeah, welcome to our podcast. Either way, today we want you to teach us what's the difference from architect and
Yeah, yeah.
because we guys in and girls in the property space think it's the same. So I think this episode will be very interesting. You giving us some tips and what we should think about when doing developments or what's the word now?
Yeah, conversions, renovations,
Yeah, exactly.
alterations to properties. Yeah, all of those sort of things.
So tell me, can't you give like the listeners a background? Who is Adrian? What do you do?
Absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, Adrian Bellingham, left school with 1.0 level in technical drawing, which probably gave me an indication as to what I should probably be doing with my life. But yeah, so I've always had a what I call like kind of spatial awareness, been able to sort of visualize things in 3 dimensions. So anything which was graphical, I did really well at. I started off in architecture back in the 90s, actually. I think I left architecture originally in 1993. After the bubble burst in the UK industry, there was a lot of turmoil. 50% of British architects were out of work at one time. All far too young, probably, in this audience to even remember that time. But for those grey-haired members like myself, I remember it vividly. So I actually took a step away from architecture in 1993. I went into sales to pay my mortgage and stayed there for another 20 years. But I was actually selling to architects for 20 years, and I worked for a number of blue chip companies where we were selling products that go into buildings or onto buildings. It's like cladding, roofing, flooring, you name it. I think I've sold everything from the underfloor heating to roofing. So I had a very commercial sort of background. Ended up as a commercial role as a sales director for a large global supplier. And then my life changed. I had a bit of a sort of change in my personal life. I won't go into the details, but there was a reason I needed to be at home to look after a fairly sick partner at the time. And in that time I took out, I actually decided to revisit my passion of architecture and started Covest Architecture over 12 years ago. And since then, we've been doing residential design predominantly because that's my passion. And then I ended up looking into doing some property investment myself. I ended up going to a number of property investment groups and networking groups. As a result of that, I ended up getting asked questions as the architectural person in the room by investors about things like HMO, serviced accommodation, commercial to residential conversions. At the time, we were just really specialists in the residential market, but I've come from a background of, I like to understand things. When people ask me a question, I like to have the answer. So I started digging into the legislation. And 5 years later, we were experts in the HMO, serviced accommodation, and commercial to residential conversion market. And in that time, we have gained a lot of wealth of knowledge, not only through our own endeavors, but also by working closely with a number of consultants, planning consultants, structural engineers, you name it. We've got them all on board now, and we've basically bled them dry, their information. And ultimately, that has just created a very sort of cohesive plan of action for any property investor. Because I guess most property investors, and like myself, when you first start in property, it is a little bit of a minefield, and you don't really know where to start. And some people start with the builder and ask a builder, what do you think I can do with this building? And typically, if he's a good builder, he'll turn around and say, you probably need to speak to an architect first to get some plans done. But equally, if you speak to a good architect, he's probably going to turn around and say, you probably need to speak to a planning consultant before you get me involved. So there's sort of a hierarchy of things you should do as a property investor. So I suppose because we've been through the learning curve ourselves to help our clients, over the years, we've effectively realized that the knowledge we've got, we just keep regurgitating that knowledge each time to an individual client. So we've done a number of training events and stuff like this I really enjoy doing because it means we hit a broader audience. yes, I'm giving away information, but it's taken me 5 to 10 years to sort of pull together. But equally, I don't like to see property investors fail. So if they actually do well on the advice that I've given, hopefully we may well get some credibility for that. And you never know, we might even get a commission on a large job where you need an architect, which you don't always need one. And we'll discuss that later as we go through this podcast.
Yeah, what a nice introduction, an interesting introduction. So you mentioned the following question for me is then, when should you use an architect? Is it when you're doing like a HMO or commercial to resi, or even on a normal buy to let? Do you need that?
Yeah, well, I think the question here is, so let's just deal with the question of architect, because an architect is someone that's done 7 years, either part-time or 5-year full-time education degree level, and they become, an architect, and they're probably members of the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects. So it's something I respect a lot. And if you're an architect, you're an architect, and that is, you've earned that right to be one. I was an architectural technologist. The difference with that would be because I was more on the construction detailing side of things. So an architect would generally sort of design a building conceptually, and then the architectural technology would be involved as part of that design team, along with other consultants like stripped engineers, to pull together that design interpretation into something that can be built. So, you can design a lot of things which look great, but they don't stand up, and builders quite often accuse architects of, how do you hold this up? Is this a sky hook we're holding this piece of building up with? It's a bit of a joke. But so you have kind of concept architects, and then you have, technicians or technologists that work as part of that team. So I started out life on the sort of detailing side, and it was only latterly, probably when I was in my 40s, that I realized when I got back into design for myself, my own business, that I had what I like to call spatial awareness. So spatial awareness is really being able to see space in 3 dimensions. And also when you look at a plan of a building with rooms and things, it's being able to look at that space and see where the underutilized spaces and the hidden space, and unlock that space to make use of it within the building. So quite often we are talking our clients out of extending a property because we can actually find that space within the property itself. And we get some funny reactions sometimes when people go, well, you're not going to make it any bigger. And I say, yeah, it's a bit like TARDIS design principles. It's like the Doctor Who TARDIS. It looks smaller on the outside, but when you step in, there's actually a lot more space internally. And for most buildings, there is a lot of wasted space. And there's a few tricks in the trade we can do, with like repositioning staircases and creating more flowing layouts. So the question is, do architects get involved in HMOs? Yes, they do. Predominantly, though, they don't. It's more tends to be an architectural technologist, a small one-man band that will be doing that sort of work. If you go to an architect's practice, and I'm sure it's not always the case, but invariably, if you did go to a large architect's practice to do, let's just say, an 8-bed HMO, because it needed planning, because it was sui generis planning, and you needed some designs, you want some ensuite bathrooms putting in, an architect would do that for you. But typically, something like that in a large architect's practice would be given to a junior member of staff to do. And therefore, you're probably not going to get somebody that qualified. Now, they may be qualified in space, but they may not be that up on legislation, because obviously, HMO is not just about design and space. It's about compliance in terms of, licensing. There are some planning restrictions as well, but, there are also building control issues that kick in when you do certain things, when you go above 6 rooms. So you really need someone. And obviously I've been through this learning curve as well. And what I realized is you can be compliant planning wise, and you can be compliant building control wise, but you might not be able to license the building after you've done it. So unless you are taking into account the licensing restrictions and the implications of licensing and getting a license, quite often HMOs will be done and they'll get planning permission and they'll get building control approval, but when the licensing people come around, they won't sign off, say, all the rooms. And a classic example of that would be, say, a room in a loft, because when people do loft conversions, quite often there's limited head height in a loft, and that wouldn't matter if it was a domestic property C3 dwelling, because you know, if you're 5'2" and your ceiling's 5'3", that's fine for you. You can walk around quite comfortably. But if you are renting, like in a HMO and it's a licensed building, then there are some criteria about minimum head heights and things like that. So a lot of investors fall foul of thinking they've got the square meterage requirements correct in terms of the floor footprint, but because of the reduced head height, that drastically reduces what can be classed as habitable space. And quite often these rooms will fall under the requirement for a HMO room, say of 8.2 square meters. The other mistake they'll make sometimes is they'll put an ensuite in a room, and that ensuite bathroom will take away the floor area from the room. And therefore it falls below the minimum standard. And unless you take the walls off the ensuite bathroom to make it an open plan, you can't utilize that space. So I guess the answer to your question is, the majority of the time, you'll find that architectural technicians or technologists will probably be involved in this market. But the key here is really to look for someone that not only can design, get planning permission for these things, but understands things like rental yield and GDV. Because again, just because someone designs something for you doesn't mean it's going to stack up financially. And quite often, one of the tasks we do with our clients is when they're asking us to convert something, say for instance, they say, well, I could get a 6-bed out of this, but I could actually go to a 7-bedroom if I go into the loft. I get that question asked probably once a week.
Yeah.
And, I get Rightmove details sent through to me. And I say, well, yeah, technically speaking, you could get 7 rooms out of this. But the cost of producing that 7th room in the loft is quite astronomical, because you've got the cost of the loft conversion itself. You've gone from a 6-bed, which is actually classed as a C3 dwelling, to a 7-bed, which is now rooms for residential use. It's a different criteria. You've got planning permission attached to it. So there's it can be a more onerous requirement from a building control perspective, and more costs involved in the renovation for the other 6 rooms. But equally, the time that you're going to take to convert that loft, you can't rent that property out whilst that's going on. So you've got 6 rooms sitting there unrented, whilst you're taking 2 months to do a loft conversion. So you've lost two months of rent. And when you start looking at the cost of that, I don't know, say 30,000, 40,000 pounds to do a loft conversion, it's going to take you a long time to claw that back. And sometimes also the fact you've got to put a staircase into that space takes away valuable space from the other floors, and that could lose, say, a bathroom on the ground floor and compromise that layout. And it makes it sometimes harder to convert back to a C3 dwelling in the future if you wanted to go down that route. So I think the answer to your question is, get an architect or a designer who understands your product. And if your product's an HMO, they need to understand that. And it's very simple, because all you need to ask them really is, how many have you done?
Yeah.
How many have you done previously? What challenges did you have with those? Have you got any examples of clients that have used you on multiple HMOs that you've had repeat business from? Because most architects will say they've worked on an HMO, but they may have only worked on one. You want someone that's worked on multiple HMOs, and also with investors that are continually using them in that area, because that will then tell you that they've worked out and they've got licensing, they've gone on to their next one. So a lot of the due diligence really is in your network. And the great thing about social media today is it's probably, the good thing about it is obviously you can get recommendations. There are bad sides about it as well, but equally, I think if you're good at what you do and someone puts out, does anyone know of anyone who's a specialist in this area, the chances are you're going to get a number of people coming back. If you ask that on a property forum, you're going to get a better response than you will do on Facebook, because in a property forum, you're going to have other like-minded investors. So the only problem you will have is if they've found a little gem, they might not want to share that if they're using it themselves.
Yeah, property is a very sharing community, but some things we don't like to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Builders and you guys, obviously. But going back to what you mentioned with HMOs, that you need to have that height, is that as well? Let's say if you have a block of flats and you're renting it out to people, would that also be an issue if the roof is too small? Or that's
So again, with flats, if they're just classed as a C3 dwelling,
yeah,
and you're renting a flat out, that the issue there currently would be if it was a new build. If it was already flats, it's existing. But if you were turning a 3-story Victorian house, which was currently a 5-bedroom house, and you wanted to split it on each floor into 2-bedroom apartments, for instance,
yeah,
so you're creating new dwellings by doing that process, then that would involve obviously creating a new dwelling through a planning application. So then you're going to be up against things like parking, amenity space standards, minimum room sizes, or minimum space standards now, which have come in. So the issue there is that with the minimum space standards, they do quote a minimum sort of floor areas for properties, depending on how many people you've got in them. And one of the strategies a lot of investors are doing now is what's called a mini mo. So effectively, it's a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 people sharing, that apartment, and the rental yields are somewhat better than maybe just renting it as a 2-bedroom apartment. The challenge with that is if it goes through planning and you show, which you'd like to do as an investor, 2 double bedrooms with double beds in there, the planners are going to look at that as a 4-person occupancy. And with the national space standards, they'll start looking for a much higher square meterage requirement. So you've got to be quite careful. And really what we're suggesting is leave the beds out of the rooms altogether and just have it as a 2-bedroom apartment. And then that way, no questions are asked. It gets approved as a 2-bedroom apartment. And then if you decide at a later date that you want to run that as a mini-mo, that's something which doesn't involve planning. So I guess the thing that I always say to any investor that comes to me is I need to know what your end game is, because I work back from there. So if someone wants to do, so most novice investors will come to me and say, I've been on a property course, multiple strategies, and I'm really liking 4 of these strategies. What I'd like, so we've got this building, we're thinking HMO, flats, or possibly serviced accommodation. And I'm like, great. So which one of those would you like me to look at today? Or all of them. I'm like, well, that's not possible, because that is a raft of work, because all 3 of those have got completely different criteria, completely different requirements from a planning perspective and social perspective, because if you're in a street and you're the only HMO in the street, you're probably going to get a load of objections. You'll be trying to put a 12-bed HMO between 2 very nice residential properties. Yeah. So there's all sorts of things to consider. And actually, what if the market changes and HMOs are not the thing in that street anymore? What's your fallback position? Well, if you've done a fully en-suited 8-bedroom HMO, yeah, great, that's going to work as a HMO, and you're probably going to go and get a commercial valuation on that. So it's going to be based on rental yield rather than bricks and mortar. So that works for HMO. You pull all your money out, leave very little in, and go and do the same again. The challenge with that property now is you can't convert that back to a C3 dwelling, because it's too far gone. 8 ensuite bathrooms is not going to be a requirement for most people wanting to buy that property. So, a lot of my investors now are looking at almost a higher level of finish and up in the standard, but actually having more shared bathrooms, or even off-suite bathrooms where there's a bathroom which is allocated to somebody, but they can use, and it's theirs and they've got a key for it, but it's not necessarily taken, it's not taken away from the bedroom, but it just means that the layout itself could, in theory, with a few tweaks, be quite easily converted back to a C3 dwelling at a later stage if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Flatted developments, again, you have to remember when you're creating individual flats as opposed to a HMO. A HMO is a house in multiple occupancy, so most of the residents know each other. They at least share common areas. Whereas in a flat, you're completely self-contained. So flats have to perform a lot better in terms of fire and acoustics. So when people are working out GDV or rental yields, what they don't do, the biggest mistake they make, is they don't work out the additional cost for those different strategies. A HMO will be cheaper than doing flats, and they don't factor that in. They're just looking at the rental income that comes out of it. So you've got to look at it holistically and think, well, actually, yes, I'm going to get a better yield, but my cost is going to be more. my bill cost is going to be longer. My bridging loan is going to be out for longer. I'm not renting these out that quickly because I've got a 6-month build process. All of these things factor into any investor's portfolio, because time is money at the end of the day. And sometimes a lot of very successful investors literally just have a strategy of doing 5-6 bed HMOs. That's it. They don't go above that, because they know once they go above that number 6, there's a whole raft of other things they need to do. And they've got a team of people that can come in and out very quickly and do those things, and they know what it is. Quite straightforward. So, but I think when you've done a few of those, there is an argument that after you've done a few HMOs, do you need an architect? Probably not, if you've got the blueprint, and you've and you understand that, and your architect has educated you. You could probably handle a 6-bed on your own. So it's all down to education level, isn't it?
Okay. So I have a question from my fiance, actually. So
okay.
So what should
nothing to do with building. I'm not a marriage guidance counselor.
So she asked, what should you think of when moving a kitchen or bathroom because of the pipes? Okay,
this is one I get all the time, and usually a lot of my investors are builders. So they come to me and they almost tell me what they're going to do with the property. But the reason why they tell me what to do is because they are thinking about the least amount of work for them internally. And moving bathrooms and kitchens involves moving all your plumbing, all your soil pipes, or creating new soil pipes. It might be, if you're flipping it from the front of the house to the back of the house, there might not be any drains at that point, and you've got to take it internally. So you've got to, every one you've got to look at on a case-by-case level. What I would say is most of the time, I do move kitchens, because what I'm trying to do is actually create open plan kitchen, living, dining in a HMO. So, and I want to create views into the garden, because, at the end of the day, the way I look at it is people seem to think a HMO is different to a house. At the end of the day, it's just more people living in it. But the same things you like in your own property, you will like in a HMO. So in your own property, if you've got a nice open plan kitchen, living breakfast with a breakfast bar, and TV on the wall and some bifolds going out into the garden, and you've got a nice seating area outside and you can see into the garden, then that's a great space to be living in. And it doesn't feel cramped, you don't feel like it's dark and dingy, so to create that, generally speaking, kitchens traditionally are on the back wall with a sink in front of a window, and like a U-shaped kitchen.
Yeah,
that's pretty old hat by today's standards. So we're usually looking at moving those kitchens back into the property, open up the back of the property with glazing and light, and then sometimes but that's not too bad, because you're moving it from a front wall or rear wall to further back into the property. But sometimes, depending on where kitchens are, they can be moved, and it can be moved upstairs. They don't always have to dominate the ground floor, especially in a HMO. Sometimes if you've got slightly, you may end up finding that a kitchen would work better on a middle floor of a 3-story property. It's then more accessible from the ground floor and the first, rather than people on the top floor having to go down 2 flights of stairs to the kitchen. It's more central. So again, case by case basis. The weird thing is, you would think in the UK, with the housing stock, there's only so many 3-bedroom terraced houses designs you could kind of come across. And you think after a while, you just create a blueprint and you just cut and paste into each scheme. We've found almost without question, every HMO we've done, there's been a slightly different tweak on it and a slightly different challenge we've had to overcome. And that's, the main thing and the main value you need to look for is that is maximizing that space. And it's not always bedrooms. And I'll give you a good example of this. I was talking to a builder not so long ago, and he was pushing for density on a project. He wanted 16 flats, I think it was, or no, 18 flats. He got 14, I think, internally, and he wanted to convert some outbuildings to make them into flats as well, just to get his numbers to work. I looked at the outbuildings, and the outlook from these outbuildings would have been pretty awful. Yeah, you could have got it to work, but it would have been great. Therefore, the rental yields would have been lower on that element. And then it would have taken away vital amenity space and parking. And I just said, look, why don't you just forget the 2 in the back garden, knock down the outbuildings, make more garden space and more parking, and actually divide what you will have lost on rental yield on those really not so good apartments, and divide it between the other 14 flats, but do a slightly higher standard and just put your rents up by £100 a month. And he did the numbers and came back and went, actually, that works. And actually works a lot better because it doesn't cost me that much more to put a nicer kitchen in. You know, it's still the same labor. You know, it's just a bit more on materials. So sometimes, you know, it's not, and this is where you've got to be careful when you're talking to your architect. Because if you are very instructional and you say, this is what I'm planning to do, some architects will just, or designers will just say, okay, that's what you want, that's what I'll give you. So you want someone that's going to challenge what you're saying and actually say, is that the best way of doing that? And more importantly, what is it you're trying to achieve from what you're doing? Is it rental yield? Is it GDV? Are you looking to convert this back at some point? What is your end game? You know, because that all impacts on what you're going to do. Because if you said, well, I'm actually just after maximum rental yield, the rental yield in this area is so low, the more units I've got, the better, because I'm not going to get the value up. That's a different brief, isn't it? To someone saying this is a really nice area, and actually sometimes by squeezing that extra apartment in could compromise the others, and that would actually detract from the value of the property and would probably make it harder to rent. So it's a bigger question, but invariably 9 times out of 10, I would say if moving a kitchen makes the property work better, flow better, and you get better rent out of it, the cost of finding a innovative solution to drainage is not an issue. You know, I don't think we've ever been stumped by drainage yet. We've managed to get away with it.
Yeah, okay. She will be satisfied with that answer, I guess. So going back to how much should an architect cost?
Wow, that's the question, isn't it? So here's the question. So I get asked that question all the time, and I thought long and hard about the answer to that question, because are we talking cost or are we talking value? Because they are two different things. So there are plenty of people out there that can draw plans, and if you know exactly what you want and you just want a plan to represent what you want to do, go to somebody who draws plans. And that costs, on a 6-bed HMO, you probably get someone to do it for £500. Yeah? Yeah. Simple as that. Yeah. And they will just draw up what you've told them to draw up. And builders tend to instruct people that can draw plans to draw up, you know, something for them, and then they build it. What you really want is someone who's going to design and look at space. So that's a design. And I would look at their previous designs or speak to their previous clients, because we had an example recently. We went out to see a domestic client that had an extension done, designed by an architect, and they went to the builder, and the builder came back and said, well, actually, this is like £150,000 over your budget. And they went, well, but we told the architect how much we had in our budget. Well, he's not listened to you. He's designed what you've asked him for, but you can't afford this. And he suggested that they speak to us, and we went and got their brief, got their budget, sat down, and then, you know, basically went through everything they wanted. And I was basically quite right. So, well, look, you know, in terms of your hierarchy, what are your must-haves and what are your nice-to-haves? Because we need to get your must-haves into this. Your nice-to-haves we can kind of, you know, consider if there's enough budget available. And unless you're designing to a budget, and the same in a HMO, you know, you're designing to a budget. So I would argue, so here's the answer. What you want to pay an architect is based on the value that they're going to put into that project. So if you came to me and said, right, Adrian, all I want to do is take the wall down between the kitchen and the dining room and make it a kitchen dining room. The other rooms are fine where they are. That's all I want doing. I would say, okay, Nana, that's not for us. I'll put you in touch with someone who can do that for you. Because there's no design involved in that. It's just taking a wall out and doing a set of drawings. And actually, you'd be paying us a lot of money to do that. Yeah. If it was like, I've got a challenge here, I've got this 3-bedroom property, I'd like a 5-bed out of it. But you know what? If I could get a 6-bed out of this, it would be perfect. But I can't see where I can get a 6-bedroom at the moment with the layout. And we look at it and we say, well, yeah, it does look like a 5-bed, but leave it with us. Let's see if we can reconfigure. And we reconfigure the space and spend a bit of time on it and be a bit innovative, and we come up with 6 bedrooms. And let's just say that 6th bedroom is worth £400 a month to you.
Yeah.
And so in a year, that's worth £4,800.
Yeah.
Because I've found the extra bedroom. So let's just say you go to architect A and he only finds 5, and you pay him £1,000. And you go to architect B and he finds you the 6th bedroom, but he charged you £2,000.
Yeah.
Which one, in hindsight, would you go with?
B.
Yeah, because you're basically, on your first year, you're sort of £3,800 better off. And after that, and you take that over 10 years, you know. So I quite often cheekily say to people, if they're saying, oh, can you get your prices down? I say, I'll tell you what, I'll do it for free. Really? Yeah, I'll do it for free. But what I want is 5% of your rental yield on anything over and above your brief.
And do they say yes?
A lot more money by taking a percentage of that increased rental yield.
And have anyone said yes to that?
No one said yes to that. They just paid my fee.
That's a really good reply.
So that's about value, not cost. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you get what you pay for at the end of the day, and it's
Yeah, yeah.
no different with services. The thing that a lot of investors get with me, or with Co-Best, I should say, is mentoring, and
Yeah.
that's worth a lot of money. You know, and I do go the extra mile to like explain things and ask questions. You know, and even things like, you know, EPC. So EPC ratings are quite topical because obviously, you know, it's moving towards a C rating now in the future for renting properties. But you can get through building control approval with a D or less. Yeah. So building control are not there to get you a C rating. They're just there to be compliant with the building regs. And planning permission doesn't insist on any particular rating for an EPC. So unless you as the investor say to your architect, by the way, I would like this HMO to be a C-rated HMO at the end of it, you're not going to get best design done, because when it comes to building control, you may end up with a D, and then you get all your tenants in, and then in, I don't know, 5 years' time, you've got all those tenants lovely and happy in that property. You've got to decant them all out into a hotel for a few weeks, whilst you would increase the insulation on the external walls to bring it up to a C standard, so you can continue to rent it in the future.
Yeah.
So you may as well do that work whilst you're in that. You don't want to be going back afterwards and taking people out. So again, there's a lot of questions that you should, you know, that you as the investor should be asking. But if you don't know what questions to ask, it's really difficult. So we work on a case of zero knowledge, and we would question our clients and just say, right, you know, first of all, how many of these have you done? It's my first one. First one, okay, we're going to ask you all the questions because, you know, we're just going to assume zero knowledge. If you've done 10 already, then I'm going to ask a lot different questions because you've already done 10 HMOs and you obviously know what you're doing, but we can still add value. But I'm not going to insult your intelligence by asking you a certain number of questions as to, you know, what your end game is.
Yeah. Oh yeah, really good tips there, Adrian. Very good. So I know you mentioned about licenses. Is this important when you go and look for your team member, architect?
Well, say licenses. I mean, licenses really. I mean, architects obviously they're either in the RIBA, architectural technologists. You've got the British Institute of Architectural Technicians. There's the ARB, which is the Architects Registration Board. All of these things really are just like, you know, bodies where people are members of, and they're all, you know, they're all good to be members of, and you know, they show a level of competency, I guess.
Yeah.
The challenge you've got in the investment world is it's not just about competency in that field, because I suppose if you looked at a small HMO, there's going to be some structural work potentially with knocking walls down. You may well need, you know, someone to go in and do a condition survey before you even buy the property to see if it's fit for purpose, you know, whether it's got rising damp or the roof's in poor repair, because you could have a lot of costs associated with just getting the fabric of the building up to standard before you start designing them. So what you're really looking for is someone who is a specialist in that area, because architects cover a massive field. I mean, you think about an architect could be designing a hospital,
Yeah.
school,
Yes.
an industrial, a power station. I mean, it's so broad. No one can specialize in everything. I when I worked for architects previously, it was shopping centers. We did a lot of shopping centers. Well, I don't think we did one residential scheme. So all we did, and because that was their niche, that was what they were good at, and they got people that could design that. But if you took one of the architects there and gave them a residential project to do, they'd probably be out their depth. So it's about finding someone that specializes in their niche. I mean, for us, we get asked to design stations, as in railway stations, gyms, and we decline it.
Yeah.
The reason we decline it is because it's not our passion, and B, it's not our area of expertise. So I would be out of my depth, and I'd have to be looking at legislation and getting up to speed on building regs, and we just understanding just the client brief around those projects. Whereas when it comes to the HMOs, serviced accommodation, commercial conversions, or residential extensions, or residential new builds, or housing developments, that is our area of expertise. That's where we know we're not going to be caught out. So you need to be looking for a specialist. That's basically it. So yeah, if they've got the accreditation, great, but accreditation is not everything.
Okay.
Reputation is better than accreditation.
Okay. And let's say if they do have, is there like a union where you can go and like complain, like, like property ombudsman, or there's...
Yeah, I mean, the thing to check out with any designer that's working for you is what level of professional indemnity insurance they carry. So if as an architect, I mean, we carry, for instance, £5 million worth of professional indemnity. So if we make a mistake on something, we could be sued up to £5 million.
Yeah.
So that gives you as an investor some recourse, because there is an ombudsman, and when you go into a contract, and a lot of the HMOs, there isn't a contract. There is a builder. There's a set of architects' plans. There may well be a specification. There may well be other additional information that people sign up to. But generally speaking, it's done on a handshake.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a professional investor and you're doing multiple projects, it's probably a good idea to have a standard form of contract that favors you rather than everyone else, that you get someone to sign up to. And then within that, you agree, if there is a problem, what course of action you're going to take. And you could go to an ombudsman to decide. And generally speaking, that needs to be sorted out. It's a bit like, I don't know, getting married and having a prenup. You kind of, you write the prenup, and then you put it in a drawer and you forget about it, because you never want to look at it unless there's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's the same with a contract. A contract is there to protect all parties. And there are things like JCT minor work contracts, which you can have. They're quite wordy. Sometimes builders can be a bit frightened of them, like, oh, that's a lot of wording. So, a set of drawings and a specification and a quotation from a builder saying what he's going to include, and more importantly, what he's not going to include, can be sufficient. But I would still get someone to look over it, maybe a chartered surveyor to look over it and advise whether that's watertight enough for all parties before you commence with a build. Because when things start going wrong, that's when you need that contract.
Yeah.
If things go well, you don't need it.
Yeah. Good answer and tips. So this one is also from my fiance.
Maybe she should be here asking these questions.
Maybe. If you buy an HMO, what is important to think of if you want to redo it to flats and then maybe later on title split them?
Okay, well, first of all, if you've got a HMO which is running as a HMO, I'm assuming the reason you'd be changing it into flats is because there's a financial benefit by doing that. Either the HMO is not running great, it's in the wrong area, it's tired, it needs a lot of work doing to it. So the main issues with changing a HMO, I mean, if it's a 6-bed HMO, it's effectively a C3 dwelling. Therefore, it's a house already. It's just in multiple occupation, and it's C4 in terms of planning definition. If it's an 8 or 9-bed HMO, then it's obviously sui generis. It's not C3. But either way, if you convert it to flats, you are going for planning permission because you are adding a number of additional residential units. So you're either going for a change of use from sui generis HMO to C3, and you're introducing, say, 3 flats, or it's already classed as a C3 dwelling, albeit C4 HMO status, and you'll then create another 2 dwellings by adding another 2 flats into it. But the most important thing when you're converting a property into flats is that you are creating separating floors and separating walls. So that's where the cost comes in, because you've got to upgrade the walls and floors because they are separate units in their own right, and acoustically and fire. And you need to start looking at means of escape, and obviously protected means of escape with staircases. So it's more of a building control issue. But equally, nowadays, if you're converting these, as I mentioned earlier, the national space standards will come in, and the planners will look at national space standards and question what you're doing. Now, just on that note, national space standards, they are fairly new. They don't have a category for a 2-bedroom, 2-person apartment. They only have a 3-person. So there is arguably a little bit of interpolation to do on those numbers. And it does actually caveat it to say, if you're doing a conversion project, then these are basically aimed at new build, and there should be some flexibility for renovations. To date, I've not seen any flexibility with the planners. Even on renovation and conversions, they are still insisting on the numbers that are quoted on those national space standards. There's no relaxation at all. So that may come in time as these standards become more common and they've been tested and people have probably gone to court on a few of these. But right now, I would say the safest bet is to work to the national space standards, because you don't want to get caught out in the future. And obviously from a mortgageability point of view, it can affect the mortgageability of these as well. Yeah.
Okay. That was a great answer that as well, and tip. So do you need a planning consultant, and when do you need it?
So good question. Really, the answer is it depends on the project, because obviously, you could be converting a project which is in a conservation area. You could be trying to convert a project which is in a C4 zone, which means that you haven't got any PD rights to convert a property into a HMO. Doesn't mean you can't, just means it's going to be more difficult. So that's probably when you would need a planning consultant. Yeah, if there's issues, you might, unlikely, but you might be trying to convert a listed building into a HMO. Or you might be adjacent to a listed building, because actually being adjacent to a listed building is sometimes just as onerous. So anything where it's not standard. If it's standard construction, you're not in a Article 4. It's a mid-terrace property. You want to change it from a C3 dwelling into a 5 or 6 bed HMO. The chances are, well, there's no planning involved because it's PD. Even if you want to make it into a 7 bed by getting into a loft space, for instance, the chances are there, again, you're not going to need a planning consultant, because you're basically converting a loft, which is no different to doing it under permitted development. When you start extending property, this is when you can get into an area where it becomes more problematic. So obviously with investors, what you have to remember is you've got a planning consultant, an architect, and an investor. The investor is going to want a 16-bed HMO with a 3-story extension out the back, taking up half the garden. Yeah. The planning consultant is going to say, no, this needs to be an 8-bed HMO, which effectively takes only goes out by 3 meters and is only 2-story, not 3-story. And the architect is basically the referee between the two, saying, look, guys, can we come to a compromise? What if we do X, Y, and Z? We go slightly larger, expecting the planners to knock it back a bit, but we end up with 14. How would that sound? So that's when you need a planning consultant, because a planning consultant will always be on the side of caution and will advise you what they're comfortable getting planning permission for. You as an investor are going to want to push the envelope and get maximize that scheme for your benefit and your rental yield. Planners aren't interested in your rental yield. They're not interested in your GDV. They're interested on the impact on neighbouring properties and whether or not there is a requirement for over-intensification of that site. And if there isn't, you're going to be pushing against a closed door. So it's good to have a planning consultant to give you, effectively, they will tell you what the planners are going to tell you. So rather than going through that long process of a planning application that takes 8 to 10 weeks and find out at the end of it, you can't do what you can do, have a planning consultant, because they will basically test it for you. It gives you a reality check on what you can expect. But then as an architect or as a designer, our job would be to push that envelope with the planning consultant and the planners a bit, and try and do something quite innovative with the design to get more rooms and more intensification than maybe the planning consultant and planners would be comfortable with. And that's the sweet spot for us. That's where a designer is actually earning his money. If he's just doing what he's told, then he's not earning his money.
So how important is it that both the planning consultant and the designer or the architect are working together?
It's really important. And I think when I first started working with planning consultants, I was quite intimidated because they were very educated, like barristers of the planning world. And they do talk in a very authoritative way, and, you tend to sort of feel like, you've been told off sometimes, when you've designed something and it's like, oh no, that's never going to stand up. So if you have a good relationship, what you can do is, outside of the ears of your client, because, is we can have quite a robust conversation, and I can push the envelope, and then I can have the planning consultant say, no, Adrian, no, they're not going to get that.
Yeah.
Actually, well, what if we do this? Well, okay, well, possibly. I'm not going to commit, and we have a bit of a negotiation between ourselves, and then we go back to the client with a scheme, because ultimately, what we don't want to do is say no, and then some other developer goes in and builds exactly what you wanted. And it's like, well, but they got away with it. So I'm always conscious that if we're going to walk away from a scheme because it doesn't stack up, anyone else walking into that scheme would also not be able to make it stack up. So it's not, we're not leaving money on the table for the client by missing a trick. So this is where the innovation in spatial awareness and design comes in, because, planning is not just about density, it's about impact on street scene, it's about impact on neighbors, and sometimes that impact is perceived impact as opposed to physically being there. And if you can kind of create schemes with very sympathetic architectural appearance and great amenity space with great landscaping, that can quite often make a scheme better. And look, the way to look at it is, if you were in a property which was worth £500,000 and someone was coming next door and converting your neighbour's property into a 16-bed HMO, how would you feel about it? Now, if they got a really good architect on board doing a great scheme and it looked amazing, you probably think, oh, actually, that looks all right. That's probably not going to reduce the value of my property. But if it was a really bad scheme with big extensions on it, you're going to put lots of rejections in. And if you feel like that, the council are probably going to feel like that as well.
Yeah. So let's say you have a planning consultant in one town. Should you get another one in a different town, or it doesn't matter?
That's a really interesting question. It's actually what I get asked a lot. In fact, I used to get asked it, what's your relationship with the planners in the area? I'm like, I don't have one. It's like, because no one's allowed to have a relationship with a planning consultant department, because it's a conflict of interest. And actually, if you're a family member, you have to declare that when you put your planning application in, and if anything, that could go against you. Wow. The key with planning consultants is most of them work nationally. Yes, they're regional in terms of they've got to be based somewhere. So we use planning consultants that are based close to where we are, just because it's just easy to work with them. But actually, what they're dealing with is national planning policy. Okay. And national planning policy is the same, all over. So they can work on a project in London or a project in Scotland, and they're dealing with policy. Logistically, yes, if you've got someone local, it makes more sense for them to travel to your project. But again, with technology now, Google Earth, Street View, plans, you don't need to go to sites. Most of the planning stuff, it's nice to be there and have a look at it. But a lot of the initial consultation can be done using technology.
Okay. Then it's good. So what are the steps you take before you're giving the drawings to the investors? Like, could you like do like a quick walkthrough?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of a process, I mean, obviously I've talked about how we question our clients before we start as to what they're looking for. You know, is it rental yield? Is it? So we go for that sort of commercial discussion first. So we understand your brief and what your exit strategy is and what you're looking to get out of the building. Equally, we like to understand what rental yields are in the area, so we know what standard we're designing to in terms of layouts and things, and like on whether we're going full en-suited or shared bathrooms, depending on the area. You know, so once we've got all that intelligence from yourself, or we know it already, we'd then start on the process. So typically, the process would be a building surveyor would go out. So let's go back a step. Before the architect, probably 7 times out of 10, you would need to send in a building surveyor to look at the fabric of the building. Now, what's confusing in the building industry is we use the name surveyor a lot. So a building surveyor could be someone doing a home buyer survey for you, which is not that useful to an investor. It could be a structural surveyor looking at structural issues, or it could be a condition survey done by a building surveyor. But what I'm talking about is a condition survey. So a condition survey is where a building surveyor will walk into your property and look at the fabric of the building. Is it sound? Is it damp? Has it got issues with, you know, walls, you know, with plaster falling off? Is the roof sound? You know, does anything need replacing? Are there cracks within the property that may indicate structural movement? You know, are there going to be any issues with settlement cracks? So, and the reason why it's important to send them in first is because when you're purchasing a property, you will get an opportunity to send that surveyor in before you've actually completed. And then what he can do is, if he, and I've had it recently where somebody had, on one of the properties they were buying, there was an extension on the rear, and it had started falling away from the back of the house because the footings weren't sufficiently good enough. And therefore there was a crack, which was about 1 centimetre at the bottom, but about 2 centimetres at the top, which was indicating this extension was falling away from the existing property. Now, in the scheme that we were proposing for this, we were actually demolishing the extension anyway, because it wasn't adding anything to it. And we were going to open the back of the property up. So the extension wasn't required. It was going to be demolished. But my client went back to the estate agents with the report and said, this will need demolishing, new footings put in, and rebuilding. And that's going to cost me £30,000. And they got £30,000 off the asking price. So for £1,000 report, they got a £30,000 saving.
Wow.
That's before we even get involved. Now, once that's all done, and we know we're walking into a building which is sound, there's no issues with it. It's just purely now dividing that space up into a 6 or 7, 8, 9 bed HMO. That's our brief. We will send our surveyor in, which is a measured building survey. So the first surveyor is a condition surveyor. The second surveyor coming in, who's a different surveyor altogether, is someone measuring the building up with his little disto, and he's doing plans, sections, elevations, everything we require for a set of existing plans. And that becomes what we work on then, what I call the concept scheme design stage. And that is where we look at different layouts and the property. We've got accurate dimensions. We can therefore plan room sizes. We can plan en suites, etc. We can plan the drainage if we're moving kitchens, like we spoke about earlier. And then we produce a number of like schematic layouts to a client. And so, well, look, we've got a couple of options. We can go for a 7-bed with, you know, 4 en suites, or we can go for an 8-bed. But you're going to have to go to like some shared bathrooms if you're going to do that. You know, what's better for you? And then we have that sort of discussion. We lock down the brief even further, and then those are the plans that then get submitted, or they get worked up into planning submission drawings, which then go in for planning if required. If it's permitted development and it's all within permitted development rights, we'll go straight to building control drawings, which are effectively the compliance drawings that you need to get signed off by building control, which can then double up as tender drawings to your builder. So there's sufficient information on a set of building control drawings to get a quote. You may be absent electrical layouts and where all your sockets are going. So you could add additional information to a set of building control drawings to make them into tender drawings. And obviously there's a full specification of materials and etc. and compliance, and things like achieving the C rating on your EPC would be part of that process as well.
Okay, very big like steps, but it's very interesting to know that.
But very defined as well.
Yeah, very
easy to
defined.
follow.
Yeah, easy to follow. Yeah, I totally agree. So, you after this that happened in London, this tower, I don't recall the name.
Grenfell.
Brentford. Yeah. EWS1 survey. Do you go through that in the building or?
So typically, a lot of the projects we deal with aren't high rise. They tend to be sort of up to 3, maximum 4 stories. So the market has changed since that happened, quite rightly so. But as a result, professional indemnity insurance has gone through the roof. So, premiums have gone. Anyone associated with designing or dealing with cladding or installing cladding will be paying a huge premium now to be doing that. So unfortunately, that has meant that has become quite a specialist field. And we wouldn't, currently, we wouldn't get involved in that. We would put you in touch with a specialist who held the required amount of professional indemnity insurance to be able to offer advice on that. But typically speaking, for most of, in the last 10 years of dealing with investors, we've not done any new build high-rise developments which have required cladding or have got existing cladding on them. Most of them are like older buildings that are being, or offices that have been renovated, or the cladding's coming off, and we're actually building a different fabric, maybe a brick skin on the outside. But yeah, it is something to be mindful of, and obviously it is a minefield now as a result of what's happened, and you would need to go to a specialist company.
Yeah.
But again, that would just be another consultant we would be appointing on the client's behalf.
Okay, so as you're aware, we're using tech. Look at your background there. There's very techy 3D. What has improved since you started, and what should you like to get more improved in your expertise in the area? In this,
well, the obvious one is behind me: 3D visualizations. Perhaps less relevant to investors because it's more of a functionality thing in terms of layouts, and you're not necessarily trying to sell the dream architecturally. It's more relevant to new builds, etc. Having said that, for internal space, it can be quite good to show open plan kitchen, living, dining spaces in a 3D format, because if you get this sort of rendered quality, which is photographic, you can be marketing your product or your HMO before it's even been done. So you can have a 3D visualization of your internal, say, kitchen, living, dining space and a bedroom, all fitted out, looking like it's going to be when it's finished, and that could be on Rightmove, getting you some inquiries, so it does help for marketing. From an architect's point of view or a designer's point of view, I guess 2 things which have been really great. I mean, one's not even relevant to architecture. I'm just going to say it. Sat nav. Yeah. I mean, I used to be brought up when you had to get a map, an atlas, and an A to Z. So actually, just getting around and meeting clients and finding places, sat nav is the best thing on the planet for me personally. That's just me, because I've lived without it. Yeah. Even better than mobile phones, if I'm honest. I'd have sat nav over a mobile phone. Yeah, definitely. Because I've been lost a lot of times. Yeah, and late for appointments. So that's a thing of the past. But Google Earth is probably the most time efficient product on the market. Google Earth is so good. You can actually see more on Google Earth now than you can when you turn up on site, because you can go up and down the street. You can look at the rear of neighbors' properties. It gives a lot of information. So think about it. Everyone has an hourly rate, and if you take my hourly rate and you ask me to go out and look at a building in the middle of Nottingham, or even go to Birmingham, if I've got an hour's drive there, an hour's drive back, and an hour inside, that's 3 hours of my time. Yeah, that's going to have to be factored in somewhere. Whereas if you give me a postcode, an address, and you send me some images of your property on Google Earth from all angles, so I've not even got to go on a Google Earth. You've just done it and you put it onto a PowerPoint presentation and sent it to me. This is the property I'm looking at, and I can see front, back, side, aerial view, street view. I can give you advice there and then. I don't have to get in the car and drive there and back. What's the point? Technology is there to help things. And then you've got things like Nimbus maps. That gives you a lot of information on ownership, land registry. It even links to planning. So you can very quickly when you're doing your sort of sourcing of properties, you can do a lot of analysis, desktop analysis of a property, flick into Rightmove, look at comparables, and you can kind of very quickly build up, almost like go through a kind of like, I suppose it's a little bit like the Tinder thing where you're sliding. Not that I know a lot about this, being happily engaged, but you're kind of going through and like, no, doesn't qualify. Oh, actually, that one, that's put right. And you can do a lot of due diligence before you even need to go and see the property. And really, I'd suggest you only need to see a property when it stacks up on all and ticks all the boxes, and you're literally going to meet the agent on site just to walk in and make sure everything you saw in the photos is represented.
Yeah.
So yeah, technology like that, Google Earth, Nimbus, and obviously to get there, SatNav.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's really nice that you guys as well can now be like remote working instead of just going there like before. Yeah, tech is good. Tech is good. I like tech.
Yeah.
So I have 4 questions that I always ask all my guests.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask this first question. If you had unlimited funds, who would you have as a mentor?
Wow. Yeah, and that's a good one, isn't it? Unlimited funds. Probably, because I would imagine he would charge quite a bit. But he's a nice guy, so once you got to know him, I'm sure he'd do your deal. Probably Richard Branson.
Richard Branson, yeah. Inspiring man, yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I like the way he approaches things. Yeah.
Okay, so one book to recommend to your children. It doesn't have to be property.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be property, because that would be me telling my children what they need to do in their lives, which I don't believe any parent should do. I think I would. I mean, look, there's a lot of. I wouldn't necessarily recommend one book, but what I would say is I would recommend a positive mental attitude book for children. So there's plenty of books out there. There's one that I know my kids have read when they were young. Or I say my kids, my friends' kids now, because my kids are grown up. There's one called "I Have a Plan" by Jamie Cosley, PMA for kids. There's a whole range of them. The thing is, positive mental attitude is something you need to be a property developer. Bit of a cliche, but look, you get knocked back more than you get success. And when people see property developers on Facebook, on LinkedIn, posting their latest successful project, what they don't see is the 50 projects they discounted to get to that point, or the 4 projects that they put money into and it didn't quite work out. So you're seeing the successes, you're not seeing the work that's gone into that. And being persistent and resilient is a key. And I think, unfortunately, today, we've probably made life very easy for our kids, compared to probably when I was a kid, and probably compared to my parents were kids, and war years and stuff. And I think resilience and persistence has been knocked out of our kids.
Yeah.
And therefore, they need to relearn the fact that, there actually pain is not a bad thing. Working out is painful, but the results you get are good. There's no gain without pain. But it's the same in business. And, when it gets hard, most people give up. The property investment attracts a lot of people because it's a sexy kind of business to work in. But when you work in it, you realize the people that are successful are resilient, and persistent, and they are hardworking. It's not a meal ticket to make. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme by any means.
Yeah.
So I think if we can get our kids learning that resilience and persistence early on in life, and maybe get them into sport and all the rest of that, then you're setting them up for the real world, aren't you?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And one book for every investor. It doesn't need to be property.
Well, this isn't property, and it's a book that I reread a few months ago after reading it 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And it's a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill.
Yeah, great.
Now, that book was written in the 1950s. And when I read it 10 years ago, it seemed like a really old book. But when I read it now, it seemed a lot less old, because we've just been through a pandemic.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the things in that book are really relevant today that maybe weren't relevant 10 years ago, despite the fact it was written 50 years ago. It's a hard read because it's kind of written in 1950s language. And quite frankly, it's better to get the adapted version, which is less sexist, because obviously times have moved on. But if you get past that and you ignore the sexist bits in it, the attitude towards men and women's gender roles, you get past that. The actual basis of that is, it is probably, I would say, it's the Bible of positive mental attitude books.
Yeah.
It was one of the first, and I think most people have used that book in some way, shape, or form and plagiarized it and put it into other things.
Yeah.
So it's a great book.
Okay, I totally agree with you. And one property book, if you have one.
Oh wow. Okay, property book. That's an interesting one, actually. Well, I would say, I mean, look, there's a lot of property books out there. And a bit like what I say to my clients is, what is your strategy? So the property book for you is going to be the one that is based around your strategy.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm currently looking at commercial conversions and using SaaS funds.
Yeah.
So I'm currently reading a book by Mark Stokes, who is a property investor himself. Really great guy, got a lot of time for him, and very, very professional at what he does, but also very understated as well. He's very successful at what he does, but he doesn't make a lot of noise about it.
Yeah.
And I kind of respect people like that. So I'm working through his book. It's got a lot of detail, but that's for me, because I'm interested in that. But if you were like HMOs, I would say find your guru in HMOs and find what that book is, because something which it's not property related, and I'm chucking another book out here there, but there's a book by Malcolm Gladwell. In fact, all of Malcolm Gladwell's books are really good, but there's one in particular, I think it's called Blink, and it's about how we make snap decisions on things, and we judge people very quickly by what we see, and it's a 30-second thing. So I think, but one of the things in that was he talks about the 10,000 hours. If you spend 10,000 hours on any subject, you are an expert. So even though I don't like using the term expert, I've spent 10,000 hours on what I do. More than that, probably 30,000 hours in the last 10 years. I've done it, 8 hours a day for 12 years. Do the maths. Yeah, it's over 10,000 hours. So if you specialize in an area and you become competent and you surround yourself with people that can support you and almost accelerate your journey by not having to do all that groundwork yourself, just have professionals that understand what they're doing as part of your team, but then read a book from somebody who's already successful in that field and learn from their mistakes. Because, if you don't, people sort of say, oh yeah, you've got to start on a small job, and make a few mistakes, get a few knocks, and then no. That's not great advice, right? Actually, avoiding mistakes is good advice. Yeah. I mean, if I walk down the street and I trip over a curb and fall flat on my face, I'm going to learn to look down and not trip over curbs. But if I see someone in front of me do it, I'm not going to walk behind them and trip over the same curb. It's like, I'm going to go, whoa, I need to avoid that. So I would much rather learn from other people's mistakes. And most entrepreneurs and people successful in life will tell you the mistakes they've made. Yeah. And you can avoid them.
Yeah. Good advice and good book. So if people would like to get in touch with you, Adrian, how can they reach out?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. So under Adrian Bellingham on LinkedIn. Covest have a Instagram page. We're on Facebook. But equally, you can contact me on my email address. I'm sure you can provide that information as well. So yeah, that's the only thing these days. You get bombarded by all these things. But equally, my telephone number is probably, because I'm quite old school, it's probably a really good way of getting hold of me as well. Yeah. Which is actually the way you got hold of me, Nana. So actually, that's probably the best way to get through to me.
That's true. But I need to say thank you very much for doing this and explaining what's the difference from architect and designer, and all of the questions that came from Emily as well. Yeah. I hope the listeners and the viewers will like this episode, because I've learned a lot. And thanks again.
Well, listen, I hope your viewers have enjoyed it today, but more importantly, I hope Emily is satisfied, because that's the main thing. We need to sort that out. And look, it's always great to share. And if in some small way I can help somebody not trip over that curb, then that's my goal for today achieved.
Nice. And we ended on that note. People, don't be stressed, invest.